The morning sun cast a golden hue over Jacob's farm as he sipped his coffee on the wraparound porch. It was a sight he never tired of, the gentle sway of wheat fields, the distant clucking of his free-range hens, and the crisp scent of the earth waking up. Owning a farm was hard work, but the reward of self-sufficiency made it all worthwhile. His animals thrived, his crops flourished, and most importantly, he had peace. That is, until Karen moved in next door. Karen wasn't like the other neighbors, who respected the unspoken rule of minding their own business. No, Karen believed in imposing her will on everyone within a 5-mile radius. She had barely unpacked before she started filing complaints. Jacob's rooster was too loud. His barn ruined the aesthetic of her property, and she even suggested he repaint his farmhouse a more modern color to match the neighborhood she wished existed. But Jacob, being the patient man he was, ignored her meddling. That patience ran thin when he stepped onto his porch one morning and nearly walked straight into a stack of buzzing wooden boxes. Beehives, 3 of them. The air hummed with activity as bees darted around his head. Jacob frowned, setting his coffee cup down on the railing before stepping closer to inspect the unwelcome additions. A laminated note was stuck to one of the hives, written in a condescending cursive. Jacob, I have generously placed these beehives on your porch as part of my pollination rights initiative. Your crops will benefit, and we all must do our part for the environment. Do not move them. Bees are a protected species, and I will report any interference to the authorities. You're welcome. Karen. Jacob read the note twice, blinking in disbelief. Pollination rights? Was that even a thing? His property, his porch, his peace, invaded without permission. He clenched his jaw, glancing at the thousands of bees that had already made themselves at home. The audacity was almost impressive. Almost. His first instinct was to storm over and demand she remove them immediately, but he knew Karen. She thrived on confrontation, and any argument would only encourage her. No, he needed a different approach. Something that would teach her a lesson without leaving her any room to play the victim. He leaned against the porch railing, a slow smirk curling his lips. Karen had made one crucial mistake. She hadn't done her research on Jacob. If she had, she would have known about Zephyr. With a sharp whistle, Jacob turned his gaze toward the barn, where a shadow suddenly broke away from the rafters. A sleek, majestic falcon spread its wings, gliding toward him with effortless grace. Zephyr landed on Jacob's outstretched arm, talons curling lightly against the thick leather glove he always wore for their training sessions. Jacob stood on his porch, watching the bees swarm around the hives Karen had so kindly donated to his property. His fingers tapped against the railing as he considered his options. Moving the hives himself could invite legal trouble if Karen made good on her threats. Calling animal control might work, but that would take time, and Jacob wasn't the kind of man to rely on bureaucracy to fix his problems. No, he preferred a more hands-on approach. Zephyr shifted on his gloved hand, tilting his sharp eyes toward the hives as if sensing his master's thoughts. The falcon was more than just a pet. He was a trained hunter, a living testament to the ancient bond between man and bird. And if there was one thing Jacob knew, it was that Zephyr had a natural distaste for buzzing, stinging creatures. Just as Jacob was planning his next move, a familiar screechy voice shattered the morning peace. Jacob, I see you got my gift. He turned to find Karen strutting up the gravel path, her manicured nails clutching a clipboard as if she were conducting an official inspection. Her oversized sunglasses sat perched on her nose, her blonde bob perfectly styled despite the country air. She stopped just at the edge of his porch, arms folded smugly across her chest. I did, Jacob said evenly, though I don't recall ordering a shipment of bees. Karen let out a patronizing laugh. Oh, Jacob, you really should educate yourself on the importance of pollination. Your little farm will thrive with my bees helping out. I read an article about it online, and I just knew you'd thank me later. Besides, you don't own the air. These bees have just as much right to be here as you do. Jacob's jaw tightened. That may be, but you put them on my porch without asking. Karen waved a dismissive hand. Technicalities, you'll get over it. Trust me, once you see the benefits, you'll be begging me to keep them here. She tapped her clipboard. And just so we're clear, I've documented their placement in case you try anything. They're protected, you know. Jacob exhaled slowly, schooling his expression into something neutral. He had dealt with difficult animals before, cattle that wouldn't move, stubborn mules, even a particularly grumpy old rooster. Karen wasn't much different. The trick was patience. "Oh, I won't touch them," he said, his voice carrying the hint of a challenge. "But don't be surprised if nature takes its course." Karen scoffed. "Whatever that means." She turned on her heel and strutted back toward her house, no doubt thinking she had won. Jacob watched her go, then looked down at Zephyr, who was still perched on his arm, ruffling his feathers in anticipation. Over the next few days, Jacob went about his routine as if nothing had changed. He tended to his crops, fed his animals, and trained Zephyr just as he always did. But all the while, he kept a close eye on the beehives sitting on his porch, their occupants busily buzzing in and out. He wasn't about to let Karen's stunt go unanswered. Sure enough, Karen wasted no time in flaunting her so-called victory. She made a point to walk past Jacob's property each morning, sipping her overpriced organic smoothie, flashing smug little smirks in his direction. "Looks like your crops are already benefiting," she called out one afternoon, motioning to his fields. "See, I told you my bees would be a blessing." Jacob simply tipped his hat. "Sure, Karen, whatever you say." In truth, the bees weren't bothering his crops, yet. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was that Karen had overstepped, imposing her will onto his land like she had some kind of authority over it. And if she thought he was just going to roll over and accept it, she was sorely mistaken. It didn't take long for nature to start shifting the balance. Zephyr, ever the keen-eyed hunter, had taken notice of the buzzing intruders. The Falcon had been trained to respond to Jacob's cues, but even without direct orders, he was instinctively drawn to the hives. Every time the bees flew too close to his perch, Zephyr would snap his beak at them, catching a few midair with terrifying precision. The real trouble started when Karen's bees began disappearing. At first, she didn't notice, but within a week, the once busy hives had noticeably less activity. Karen finally realized something was wrong when she came stomping up Jacob's driveway one morning, her arms flailing in outrage. "Jacob," she shrieked, stopping at the base of his porch. "Something is happening to my bees." Jacob, seated comfortably on his rocking chair, raised an eyebrow. "Your bees." Karen huffed. "Yes, the ones I so kindly provided for your farm. I've been monitoring their activity and the numbers are dropping. I demand to know what's going on." Jacob took a slow sip of his coffee before gesturing toward the barn, where Zephyr sat perched, his sharp eyes locked onto Karen. "Well, Karen," he said casually, "seems like nature is just taking its course." Karen followed his gaze, and then she saw it. Right on cue, Zephyr launched from his perch, gliding effortlessly toward a bee that had strayed too far from the hive. In a flash, his beak snapped shut and the tiny insect was gone. Karen let out a strangled gasp. "Why, your monster is eating my bees." Jacob shrugged. "Falcons are natural predators, Karen. Just like how your bees have the right to be here, so does Zephyr. I didn't interfere, I just let nature do its thing." Her face turned an alarming shade of red. This is outrageous. You have to stop him. You have to put him in a cage or something." Jacob leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Now, Karen, that wouldn't be fair, would it? You told me I couldn't move your beehives because they're a protected species. Well, Zephyr's protected too, by me." Karen sputtered, completely at a loss for words. Jacob simply leaned back in his chair, tipping his hat down over his eyes. "Oh, and Karen," he added lazily, "you might want to move those hives before Zephyr eats the rest of your bees, just a friendly suggestion." She let out an enraged shriek before stomping away, leaving Jacob with a satisfied grin. The trap had been set. Now all he had to do was wait for her next move. Karen wasn't one to admit defeat easily. If anything, Jacob's calm dismissal only fueled her rage. The next morning, she was back, clipboard in hand, her lips pursed so tightly they nearly disappeared. Jacob watched from his porch as she marched up his driveway, her determination practically radiating off her like heat on asphalt. "This is harassment," she announced before Jacob could even say a word. Jacob raised an eyebrow. "Harassment?" "Yes, you're allowing that." she pointed dramatically at Zephyr, who was preening his feathers on the barn roof. Beast to target my bees, you're sabotaging my pollination initiative and I won't stand for it. Jacob barely hid his smirk. Karen, I haven't done a thing. Zephyr is just doing what falcons do. Kind of like how you said the bees were doing what bees do. I'm just respecting nature's balance. Karen's eye twitched. You think you're clever, don't you? Jacob took a slow sip of his coffee. A little. She took a deep breath, clearly struggling to maintain her composure. Fine, she snapped. You leave me no choice. I'll be filing a formal complaint with the local wildlife authority. Let's see how they feel about your trained killer terrorizing protected pollinators. Jacob fought back a chuckle. You go right ahead, Karen. With a victorious huff, she spun on her heel and stormed off. Jacob watched her go, shaking his head. She was in for quite a surprise. That afternoon, while Karen was likely drafting her absurd complaint, Jacob made a few calls of his own. One to a friend who worked at the local wildlife conservation office, and another to a falconry expert he'd trained under years ago. As expected, neither had any concerns about Zephyr's actions. He was a licensed falconer, and Zephyr was a legally protected bird of prey. Karen had no case. But Jacob wasn't done yet. If Karen wanted to play dirty, he'd show her just how messy things could get. The next morning, he made a few adjustments to his property. First, he moved Zephyr's perch closer to the porch, ensuring the falcon had an even better vantage point of the hives. Then, he scattered a bit of raw meat around the barnyard, a trick he knew would attract more hungry birds of prey from the surrounding woods. If Karen thought Zephyr was a problem, she was about to have an even bigger one. Sure enough, within hours, a couple of hawks and a lone kestrel had joined Zephyr in his new hunting ground. The air above Jacob's farm became a no-fly zone for any insect unfortunate enough to stray too high. By midday, the buzzing of Karen's bees had dwindled to a pitiful murmur. And then, just as he expected, the screaming started. Jacob leaned against the porch railing as Karen came sprinting from her yard, her arms flailing as a hawk swooped overhead. "Jacob," she shrieked, "what did you do?" He took another sip of coffee, watching her with amused indifference. Karen stomped up Jacob's driveway, her usually pristine appearance disheveled. Strands of her perfectly styled bob stuck out at odd angles, and there was a smear of dirt on her designer yoga pants. Jacob had to fight the urge to laugh as she jabbed a finger toward the sky, where Zephyr and the newly arrived hawks circled like silent sentinels. "This is a coordinated attack," she shrieked. You've turned my property into a hunting ground." Jacob tilted his head. "Now, Karen, that's a bit dramatic. I didn't do anything. Just seems like the local birds of prey have taken an interest in your little pollination project." He gestured toward the dwindling number of bees buzzing nervously around the hives. "Nature sure is fascinating, isn't it?" Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red. "This is your doing. You're manipulating the ecosystem to sabotage my bees. I will not stand for this." Jacob sighed, pretending to think. "Well, Karen, you said I couldn't move the hives because the bees had the right to be here, but Zephyr and his friends," he motioned toward the sky, "they've got just as much right. You wouldn't want to interfere with the natural balance, would you?" Karen let out a frustrated scream, practically vibrating with rage. "You think this is funny?" Jacob chuckled. "Oh, I know it is." Karen straightened, taking a deep breath as if trying to compose herself. "Fine," she spat. "I'll handle this myself." Jacob watched, curious, as she spun on her heel and stormed back toward her house. A few minutes later, she returned, armed with what could only be described as the most ridiculous solution imaginable. A gigantic beekeeper suit. Jacob nearly choked on his coffee. Covered head to toe in thick white fabric, Karen stomped back toward the hives with a comically oversized helmet making her head look twice as big. She was armed with a bee smoker, a small metal canister puffing out white clouds meant to calm the bees. Only she wasn't using it properly. Instead of carefully directing the smoke, she was wildly waving it around like some kind of lunatic warding off spirits. "Go away," she shouted at the sky, shaking the smoker toward Zephyr and the hawks circling above. "Leave my bees alone." Jacob folded his arms, watching the spectacle unfold. The birds, of course, were completely unbothered. They simply glided overhead, waiting patiently. The bees, on the other hand, were not happy. Agitated by Karen's aggressive flailing, a few began buzzing around her in distress. "No, not me," she shrieked, waving the smoker more violently. Jacob sighed. "Karen, you do realize that you're the one stressing them out, right?" "I don't need your farmer wisdom right now, Jacob," she screeched, slapping at the air around her. And then it happened. One bee, perhaps deciding it had suffered enough of Karen's nonsense, made a direct attack, stinging her right on the thigh. "Ah-ah-ah-h-h-h-h!" Karen's scream echoed through the fields. She dropped the smoker, stumbling backward, slapping at her leg. The suit, of course, made her movements even more clumsy and within seconds. Thump! Karen fell flat on her back, arms flailing, legs kicking, looking like an overturned turtle in a beekeeper costume. Jacob took a long, satisfied sip of his coffee. Karen flailed on the ground, her oversized beekeeper suit turning her into a writhing, white marshmallow. She kicked her legs, waving her arms, all while screaming at the top of her lungs. "Jacob, help me up, I'm being attacked." Jacob leaned against the porch railing, watching the scene with barely concealed amusement. "Karen, you got stung once, and that was your fault." Karen continued to squirm, managing only to roll herself a few inches closer to the hives. Bad move. A few more bees, still agitated from her wild flailing, took notice. One landed on her mesh-covered faceplate, another buzzed dangerously close to her ear. "Oh, no, 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 get them off of me," she screeched. Jacob sighed, setting his coffee cup down before strolling over. All right, he muttered. "Hold still." He reached down and grabbed her by the arm, hauling her up with far more ease than he should have for someone her size. Karen barely had time to find her footing before she realized something was missing. Her helmet. The mesh veil had come loose when she fell, and now it dangled uselessly behind her. Worse still, the bees noticed. Karen froze. "Jacob," her voice was much smaller now. Are they still around me?" Jacob took a step back, rubbing his chin. "Oh yeah, couple of 'em, one on your shoulder, two right near your face." Karen let out a strangled whimper. What do I do?" Jacob smirked. "Don't move." For once, she listened. The problem was, Zephyr was still watching. The Falcon, ever the opportunistic hunter, had remained perched nearby, keen eyes tracking the flurry of movement. He saw Karen's frantic swatting earlier, saw the bees reacting, and now, with her standing stiff as a board, he saw a threat. With a piercing cry, Zephyr launched from his perch, wings slicing through the air like a blade. Karen barely had time to blink before the Falcon swooped down, aiming straight for her shoulder, where one of the bees had landed. Ch. Karen shrieked, bolting across the yard in full panic mode. Zephyr, having already plucked the bee clean out of the air, veered off effortlessly, but Karen didn't stop running. She tore down the driveway, flailing her arms wildly, convinced the Falcon was still after her. Jacob chuckled, watching her disappear back toward her house. He turned to Zephyr, who had already returned to his perch, looking quite pleased with himself. "Well, buddy," Jacob said, tossing the Falcon a small treat, "I think that's the last we'll see of her beehives." And sure enough, by sundown, Karen was back, this time wearing full-length gloves and a thick scarf wrapped around her head for extra protection. Without a word, she began hauling the hives off his porch, huffing and muttering curses under her breath. Jacob simply rocked in his chair, watching with a contented smirk. It wasn't often that nature handled his problems for him, but when it did, it sure was satisfying. Karen struggled to drag the heavy beehives back to her property, huffing and muttering under her breath. The beekeeper's suit, already too bulky for her, made her movements clumsy, and every few steps she nearly tripped over her own feet. Jacob, sitting comfortably on his porch, didn't lift a finger to help. Instead, he sipped his coffee, rocking gently in his chair as he enjoyed the show. From his perch, Zephyr let out a low, amused screech, as if mocking Karen's predicament. "Oh, shut up, you flying menace," Karen snapped, glaring at the Falcon. Jacob smirked. Now, Karen, that's no way to talk to a protected species. She shot him a death glare but kept moving. The moment she reached her side of the property line, she let go of the hives with a thud, ripping off her gloves and tossing them to the ground. This, she seethed, pointing a trembling finger at Jacob, is far from over. Jacob raised an eyebrow. Oh, you still got more wildlife to gift me. Karen's lips curled into a sneer. You think you're clever, don't you? You sabotaged my initiative. I had plans to register my property as a protected pollinator sanctuary, and now you and that winged assassin have ruined everything. Jacob chuckled. I didn't ruin anything, Karen. You just forgot one simple fact. Karen crossed her arms. And what's that? Jacob gestured toward the now bee-free space on his porch. This is my land. You don't get to decide what happens on my property. Maybe next time you'll ask before dumping a bunch of buzzing tenants on someone else's porch. Karen's jaw clenched. You are the worst neighbor. Jacob grinned. And yet I've lived here for years without a single problem until you moved in. For once, Karen had no response. Her face twisted in frustration, but she didn't argue. She stomped back toward her house, muttering something about city councils and revenge, but Jacob wasn't worried. He had a feeling she'd think twice before trying to pull another stunt like this. As Karen disappeared inside, Jacob turned back to Zephyr. The Falcon fluffed his feathers, looking quite pleased with himself. The next morning, Jacob stepped onto his porch, coffee in hand, and took in the peaceful sight of his farm. The air was crisp, the wheat fields swayed gently in the breeze, and most importantly, there were no unwelcome beehives buzzing near his doorstep. Zephyr sat proudly on his perch, watching over the property like a silent guardian. After the chaos of the past week, things had finally returned to normal. Or so he thought. A loud thud came from the property line. Jacob turned his head just in time to see Karen struggling to set up a large wooden sign at the edge of her yard. Dressed in her usual smugness, she hammered it into the ground, stepped back to admire her work, then shot a pointed look toward Jacob's porch. Curious, Jacob strolled over. As he got closer, the words on the sign came into view. Private property. DESIGNATED Pollinator Sanctuary. No hunting or bird-related ACTIVITIESALLOWED. Jacob stared at the sign, then at Karen, who stood with her arms crossed, smirking triumphantly. Well, she said, since you ruined my first initiative, I decided to make it official. My property is now a pollinator sanctuary, and your murder bird is not welcome near it. Any interference and I will report you. Jacob took a slow sip of his coffee. You do realize that sign means absolutely nothing, right? Karen's smirk faltered. What? Jacob motioned toward the sky, where Zephyr and a few other birds of prey were already circling. See, Karen, you can't stop wild birds from flying wherever they want. You can't put up a "No Hawks Allowed" sign and expect them to listen. He took another sip. Nature doesn't follow HOA rules. Karen's face twitched. You think you're so clever, don't you? Jacob grinned. No, Karen, I know I am. With a dramatic huff, Karen spun on her heel and marched back toward her house, leaving her ridiculous sign standing there like a monument to her stubbornness. Jacob chuckled and shook his head. Karen had lost this battle, but knowing her, she'd probably cook up another ridiculous scheme soon enough. For now, though, he had his peace back. He strolled back to his porch, leaned against the railing, and whistled. Zephyr swooped down from his perch, landing gracefully on Jacob's gloved arm. Looks like we won, buddy, he murmured, stroking the falcon's sleek feathers. Again. As the sun rose higher, Jacob went about his day, content in the knowledge that his land was still his own, and that Karen had finally learned an important lesson. Some people fight battles with rules and regulations. Jacob. He let nature handle it.